Welcome everyone to this fourth session of the series of webinars on qualitative methods co-sponsored by the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology at the University of Alberta and ATLAS.ti. So today we have Dr. Rosalind Barbour from the Open University in the UK who will be presenting about focus groups. But I will let Amanda Shuya, the director of IIQM, I will ask her to introduce Dr. Barbour. But before I give Amanda the microphone, I would like to say a few words about this technology, GoToWebinar. Well, we expect about 40 people today. Because of the large number of attendees, we have to keep your microphones muted, okay? So that means that if you need to speak, you can raise your hand. However, I would like to suggest the following. I would like to suggest that in the first 20 or so minutes, Dr. Barbour will be presenting. She will present her what she had planned for today. After that, Amanda Shuya will ask Dr. Barbour a few questions, kind of as an interview focusing on precisely on focus groups. And after that, I believe that we are going to open the microphones for questions and answers. We expect the last 15 minutes, more or less, to be dedicated to questions and answers. Now, while Dr. Barbour is presenting, you should feel free to write your questions using the questions pane in the control panel. And in fact, you can practice now. You can just say hello or something like that, and I would know that you can use the control panel, right, the questions pane. So at the end of her presentation, I'm going to go over these questions, and at that moment, I will give the microphone to those who want to speak, okay? So, and one more thing, just one more thing. If you happen to disconnect from this session, the only thing you have to do is to go back to the same email message that you used to connect in the first place, click on the same link, and that will reconnect you to the session. If any of the presenters happens to get disconnected, they will have to do the same thing. Okay, go back to their email messages and click again on the link. But we hope that nothing of that is going to happen this time. So let me ask Amanda to say a few introductory words.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm so pleased that Dr. Rose Barbour could join us today for this webinar and is willing to present on focus groups. As Ricardo had mentioned, she is a professor of healthcare at the Open University in the UK. She has a particular interest in rigor in qualitative research and has also published widely on this topic in a range of academic journals. Dr. Barbour is a medical sociologist whose research career has covered a wide variety of topics. Some of the topics include HIV, AIDS, reproductive health and fertility, psychosocial health, obesity, and the sociology of recovery. Her theoretical interests center on the links between identity and agency and social and cultural capital. Dr. Rose Barbour has also been a presenter and workshop instructor at many IIQM events, and we're very pleased that she could join us today. Without further ado, Rose, please take it away.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to give you now the controls, Rose. So what I will do is this. I'm going to make you a presenter, and now you have to say yes if there is a window that will pop up asking you to be the presenter. Okay, good.
Okay.
It's all in your hands now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. This is a first for me talking to a virtual audience. So good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone where you are. As Amanda has said, my own background is in medical sociology, so quite a lot of the examples I'm going to be using are going to be drawn from my own work in that area, but I hope even if that's not the area in which you work yourself, that the examples will still work for you to illustrate the points that I'm trying to make. I think one of the things that has struck me over the years in terms of focus groups is that there seems to be quite a lot of angst surrounding the use of focus groups, that people often ask or ponder really whether they've used proper focus groups or not. And I think the reason for that really is that there are a number of different models or even traditions of focus group use, each of which has produced its own set of guidelines, its own advice, which although it can be very helpful if you're working within that tradition, is not necessarily so helpful if you take that advice out of context. So, for example, marketing research, where focus groups have perhaps got the longest pedigree, very often there's not very much attention paid to analyzing the data, because really it's about deciding whether to go ahead with launching a product, with mounting an advertising campaign. So there's quite a lot of talk about the actual convening of the groups, but not so much about analysis. Organizational R&D as well tends to be client-focused, so it's not the researchers defining the problems for attention. So that leads to rather more applied applications. Moving on really to community development, I think that's quite interesting, because although focus groups have often been used in terms of participatory action research approaches with the aim of really affecting change to empower people who are disadvantaged, there's also been a growing use in terms of what I call professional projects, which relate to developing, for example, consensus guidelines in primary care and in many other fields of professional practice. So I think that's quite interesting and is one to watch. When we come to health services research, social sciences research, there's really a whole range of usages, with focus groups quite often, as indeed with community development and action research approaches, quite often used alongside other methods. And there's quite a variation to the extent to which that's theory-driven, to which it attends to disciplinary interests and concerns. So I think that there's really a whole spectrum there. And I think my advice has always been not to necessarily dismiss any of these traditions or the techniques or approaches advocated, but to really make a considered decision depending on your own research question, the settings and the groups in which you're carrying out your research. In terms of providing a definition for focus groups, this is something that Jenny Kitzinger and I came up with in this edited collection that we published back in 1999. And whilst this may seem a really quite permissive definition, it actually asks for quite a lot on the part of the researcher, because thinking about encouraging interaction involves the planning of the focus group, the putting together of your topic guide, thinking about how you put your groups together, how you convene them, how you actually moderate the groups to encourage interaction, but also being attentive to the group interaction, thinking about what's happening in the group as the discussion unfolds, picking up on cues, exploring with people any differences, any shades of meaning, and also being attentive to what's actually taking place in terms of the group dynamics and anticipating analysis. So although it might seem quite a permissive definition, it's really quite demanding. I think the most difficult thing about running focus groups really is striking the right balance. And focus groups have been described, sadly, not by me, but by someone else, in fact, in the marketing research tradition, as involving structured eavesdropping. And I really like that description because I think it captures the balance really between providing structure in terms of the planning, in terms of thinking about your research design, your questions, your topic guide, and this sort of more spontaneous aspect of the interaction. So that I think if you put the work in up front, very often as a moderator, you can hopefully sit back and take a back seat as the discussion unfolds. I just wanted to run through some of the practical aspects involved in planning and running focus groups. There's a lot of textbooks, obviously, that deal with this, but really looking first of all at sampling choices. And very often people ask, you know, how big should the focus groups be? How many focus groups should I run? What should be the composition of the focus groups? And of course, there is no magic bullet. There is no one-size-fits-all. It really depends, firstly, on your research question, but secondly, on the constituencies that you want to include. Who are the groups who might actually have a different take on the topic that you're investigating? So that you might also think about how you're going to manage the size of the groups. And that will depend on how detailed, how in-depth an analysis you want to do. And basically, the more detailed and in-depth an analysis, the fewer people I think you can cope with in a focus group discussion. So I would generally say a maximum of around 6 to 8 if you're going to do a fairly fine-grained analysis. But that's just really an indication. Thinking about the composition of the groups, most of the textbooks advise selecting people on the basis of some common characteristic, but you don't want groups to be too similar. Very often the discussion is about the potential for tension and disagreement and fears about provoking that. But actually, I think a bigger danger is that you can end up recruiting a group who are too similar to each other, and then it's not really going to be all that helpful if all that happens in your focus group is that people just nod their head and agree with each other. Fortunately, although it's hard to get it absolutely right, I think it's almost impossible to get it absolutely wrong, and that even if you select people on the basis of similarity, they are going to differ from each other in different respects, whether that's age, whether it's gender, whether it's other aspects of their circumstances which you as a researcher may not be aware of. I think it's very helpful to have more than one moderator, someone to do some of the housekeeping work, just to kind of pick up on any cues as those happen, to help you with the timing if you've got various exercises. Thinking about setting the scene for discussion, I think it's important to say that there's no such thing as a neutral setting, but it's also crucial that you think about the relevance and the meaning of that setting, what that suggests to the people that are taking part, because that will colour what they're going to say. It will shape the discussion. But of course, if you realize that, you can insert other questions to make sure that it doesn't dominate the discussion. Thinking about developing your topic guides, choosing your stimulus materials, and they are very short topic guides for focus groups generally, but that belies the amount of preparation that goes into those, the piloting, particularly just making sure stimulus materials are just to stimulate discussion. That's all they are. They don't need to be desperately clever, but they need to be fit for purpose, and you need to pilot. Thinking about preparing for effective moderating, this is going back to what Jenny and I said about the definition, being attentive to the interaction. Don't just go in with your topic guide and think that's the job done. Pay attention to what's happening, pick up on cues, use prompts, think about the differences, similarities between people, and also as your project unfolds, the differences and similarities between a specific group and previous groups, and anticipating the analysis. So really you are keeping a lot of balls in the air at the same time. In terms of making research design choices, one of the things that Jenny and I said in that early book was that we thought that a lot of the time people were adopting focus groups when actually they should be adapting focus groups. And by that I mean borrowing from any tradition, any application that suggests to you that it's going to help you generate the data that you want. Very often when it comes to research design and choosing focus groups, people assume that there are certain economies involved. And I think very often they're perceived economies, that people think focus groups will be quicker, will be easier, will be less expensive. And sometimes focus groups are used as backdoor surveys. They're certainly not appropriate if you want to measure attitudes and opinions, because you're not going to be drawing a representative sample in the first place. Also, focus groups are sometimes chosen where it's felt that one-to-one interviews would be too time-consuming, too challenging to set up, whether it's not possible to carry out observational fieldwork, ethnographic studies. But again, I think, as any of you who've done focus groups will be aware, it's not so easy to set up focus groups, and it's not necessarily the quickest and most straightforward option. There's been a bit of a debate about naturalism versus artificiality and researcher-convened groups as opposed to naturally occurring groups. But I do think sometimes that distinction is overstated, because if you pay sufficient attention to developing your topic guide, to making sure that the stimulus material is fit for purpose, generates discussion on the topics you want to focus on, then you really can often as a moderator take a back seat and almost become an eavesdropper as the discussion unfolds. There are, I think, some aspects in terms of capitalizing on the full potential of focus groups, and I think it's a pity, because sometimes when focus groups are adopted rather than adapted, people don't necessarily pay attention to the full potential, and it is an incredibly versatile and flexible method that I do think, when used appropriately, can afford unique insights into specific topics and specific areas. The defining features of focus groups really are that they allow for the study of interaction between participants. They may uncover why people think as they do, and as David Morgan has famously said, they're useful when it comes to investigating what participants think, but they really do come into their own in terms of uncovering why participants think as they do. They can be especially useful, I think, for addressing why not questions as well. So things like the non-uptake of screening programs, of particular health interventions in my field, why, for example, some people don't vote, why they don't recycle, take action against climate change. And I think if you find the words why not creeping in, it's an indication that focus groups are likely to be appropriate. They don't put individuals on the spot. the way that one-to-one interviews do, and they kind of give people permission to debate and to justify their own behavior. They can be useful in accessing hard-to-reach groups, and they're often used for disengaged youth, for so-called minority ethnic groups. They've been used a lot with children. But of course, groups that are hard to reach may also be hard to reach via focus groups. So I think it's important to understand the culture and the environment in which you're planning to do the focus groups. And that will help you to plan, to know whether it's going to be appropriate to mix genders, to mix people of different ages, of different status, those sorts of issues as well. And that may be partly why people are hard to reach, because the approaches can be inappropriate. Focus groups can give access to the process of opinion formation, just really whatever's happening in the focus group, whether that's handling of conflict, whether it's achieving of consensus. But the key here is on process. There are quite a lot of claims made for focus groups, certainly in terms of accessing experience. I think that's actually the very least of what focus groups can do. But I think there are some rather more ambitious claims made on the part of focus groups to do with representation and even empowerment. And what I would say is that although focus groups can be empowering, that's not necessarily a feature of focus group discussions. It depends on the broader context in which they are embedded, in which they are applied. And this is a very useful reminder from Mick Bloor and colleagues, reminding us that focus groups aren't the authentic voice of the people, and that really, just like any other research method, they have their advantages and disadvantages and their challenges. And I think it's important to remember that, because focus groups can be very powerful and can be used to political ends as well, really. They can, I think, as I said, illuminate the process of opinion formation. And this is an example really from my own field of work in medical sociology. But this was looking at public perceptions with regard to the allocation of donor liver grafts. And this followed, interestingly, this study followed up on survey findings, which is quite unusual. It's quite often the case that focus groups are used in the initial phase of a research project, but here they're being used to further investigate the results of a survey. And armed with this knowledge, the researchers developed these 5 unfolding scenarios, which gave really very nuanced understandings of how people weighed up the different circumstances, the different factors involved, and actually provided an insight into how people might modify and revise their opinions, which I think can be incredibly helpful. This again is another example in terms of the real economies that focus groups can afford. And the real economies they can afford, I think, relate to the potential for comparison, but only if you pay attention to that in terms of the research design. This was a study taken that took place in 4 different European countries, looking at public understanding of food risks. And it stands out, I think, because of the strategic sampling that was involved. They didn't just hold these public focus groups in the 4 countries. They thought about who they wanted to talk to within the populations, and they actually selected people at different points in the life course. So people without children, people with young children, people whose children had left home, single households, and they carried out in 9 focus groups just in each of the 4 countries, which really was very economical, but did allow for very in-depth findings. And I certainly recommend that paper to you, because I think it's often the case that people assume that qualitative methods can't be used in these cross-cultural international comparisons, and I think they can, provided enough attention is given to research design. This is another area where it's also pays to really review your sampling strategies as the project unfolds, so that you can pay attention to individual voices, and you may actually decide to convene different groups. We did a project looking at GPs, family physicians' experience of issuing sickness certificates to patients, and we came to suspect that GP locums who filled in for holidays and sickness had rather different concerns to those of GP registrars who were at an advanced stage in their training. And again, there were different issues for the GP principals who were the leaders of the practices. But we weren't sure because they'd been distributed throughout our focus groups. So we ran a second stage of focus groups, just 3 focus groups, one with each of those constituencies. It's very interesting because it doesn't necessarily mean you need to go back to the ethics committee. You're not talking to different people, you're just bringing them together in different configurations. In terms of the unique potential of focus groups, I think they really are coming to their own in terms of capturing immediacy, particularly one example I came across was some focus groups in Australia that people convened shortly after the UK Princess Diana died. In the UK at the moment, we're all in a lather because our former Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, has just died, and there's a huge state funeral tomorrow, which has given rise to all sorts of discussion and debate. So perhaps someone will rush off and convene focus groups, even as we're speaking at the moment. Some people also carried out some research in the USA in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. But this is an example from the field of medical sociology, again, looking at the human papillomavirus vaccination program, which of course was very controversial because it was targeted at young women and all sorts of issues about them being sexually active. And this was a study that looked at the perceptions of mothers. And actually, they capitalized on the fact that there was a campaign, a media campaign that was set in motion, I think, after they started the study. But they used this to explore the change in emphasis in terms of perspectives of groups held at these 2 different points. And of course, this highlights the capacity of focus groups to access and reflect rapid and incremental change. And of course, that's one of the reasons why marketing researchers are so fond of focus groups. I wanted to move on now to say a few things about analysis, and that often people are concerned about the challenges in analyzing focus groups. And I think it's quite surprising that what exercises people quite a lot of the time is the variations between focus group sessions. But I'd actually be very worried if there weren't differences between focus group sessions, bearing in mind that you should be really convening groups in order to maximize the potential for comparison. But in terms of the variations between focus group sessions, that may actually just be down to the different settings, the different composition of the groups, the different group dynamics, the different moderators, and that's actually a resource at your disposal for analyzing your data and for coming to understand the impact that all of those things have on shaping the data. Likewise, difficulty in interpreting silences. Silences, of course, can speak louder than words, and what is not said can be equally important, as long as you have given people the opportunity to actually focus on those issues. And don't forget, you can always ask people, if you're anticipating the analysis, you can always ask people if they haven't actually mentioned a particular topic. So-called slippery views. I think when people get worried about slippery views, it is really because they are thinking that they can use focus groups to measure people's attitudes and opinions. And this is a useful reminder from Pochter and Potter, who are a marketing research and psychology pair who've worked together a lot. And they remind us that attitudes are performed, not preformed. And I think that that's a very useful point to bear in mind. In terms of analysis, there's often a distinction made between the applied and theoretical continuum, so that in health services research, for example, some of the research is very much focusing on evaluating health promotion campaigns and looking at people's response to treatment regimes, their understandings, their experience of chronic illness, those sorts of issues, whereas at the other end of the continuum, research may actually be driven by disciplinary concerns and theoretical frameworks and interests. But I do think that a priori codes have their uses, as does content analysis, and by that I mean very simple thematic analysis. It all depends really on what the aims of the research are. And this is a more recent paper from David Morgan, who points out that saying that the interaction in focus groups produces the data isn't the same thing as saying that the interaction itself is the data. So that I think it's perfectly permissible to use focus group data in this way, although I would say that paying attention to some theoretical frameworks can pay dividends even at the more applied end of the spectrum. And I've also of late come to think a lot more about the potential of hybrid approaches, and I've drawn quite a bit in a recent book chapter that I've written on the work of Ben Tehalkia, who talks about bringing together frame analysis, discursive psychology, and conversation analysis in analyzing focus group data. And I think there's a great deal of potential not to take too rigid an approach here. And again, I think the whole business is about achieving a balance between structure and creativity or responsiveness. So thematic analysis, I think all analysis is essentially based on a variant of thematic analysis. It's just that what counts as themes varies. Grounded theory, where we're looking at the categories of our participants, we're trying to develop and identify in vivo codes, bearing in mind that there'll be some surprises along the way. And this is really very similar to the approach in frame analysis, which really involves us in looking at the lenses or explanatory frameworks that our participants use to make sense of their worlds, their experiences, whether these are explicit or, as was more often the case, whether they're implicit. And I think when we do research that's informed by theoretical frameworks, that's what often provides us as researchers with our frames or lenses. But we need to be alert to where the data doesn't fit as well. Looking at conversation analysis, discourse analysis, I think that that can be very, very useful, looking at how speech and interaction is accomplished. And although traditionally that involves having a specific Jeffersonian form of transcription, I think it is possible to benefit from some aspects of that sort of analysis without having to do a full-blown conversation analysis or discourse analysis through the whole transcript. And I certainly have at times used it to try to make sense of a particular data excerpt, particularly some problematic data excerpts. And perhaps we can talk a bit more about this later. But I think, again, as with everything I've said about focus groups, don't feel you need to be shoehorned or completely nail your colours to the mast, that I think flexibility is key. In terms of some concluding advice, I'd say to attend to research design issues. Don't just rely on brainstorming focus groups. Think about maximising the comparative potential. Think about other groups that you might include in terms of saturation, which is probably an ideal none of us ever reach, but at least, you know, trying to get closer, thinking about wild card groups, as Jenny and I called them, you know, just ideas that occur to you along the way, second stage sampling that we talked about, returning to the field, which doesn't need to be a huge production, it can be quite focused. Capitalizing on participants' insights, but not to take those at face value, and indeed not to take the theoretical frameworks at face value either, but to remain skeptical and critical. Explore the potential of hybrid approaches to research design, drawing on the different traditions, and to data analysis. And be mindful, I think, as well of the political context, because I think focus groups are very powerful and can sometimes be co-opted by different factions, and I think we do have to be aware of that. Just to end, there are some references here. This is to my own book on doing focus groups, which is part of the Qualitative Methods kit that Sage produced, but the first two chapters are available free online. Another chapter in this edited collection by Bourgeois, Dingwall and De Vries, which is, because it's about health research, contains some more discussion about some of the papers that I've highlighted today. This chapter in Analysing Focus Group Data, called Analysing Focus Group Data in this handbook, which is where I talk about developing this hybrid approach, and it's in relation to some focus groups that I conducted myself, which is unusual for me these days, but they were with women about losing weight after the delivery of their babies, and were incredibly lively focus groups. And this last one, which is also in press, which is the second edition of my Introducing Qualitative Research textbook, which is substantially revised and has a chapter 6 in that on focus groups. And just to end, in case any of you are nearer to Milton Keynes, where I'm based, we do run a series of qualitative methods workshops at the Open University. Those include focus group workshops. We're just about to do a couple next week on analysing qualitative data, and we do workshops on writing up as well. So that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose. Very clear. Now let me ask Amanda. Amanda, would you like to ask Rose some questions? And,
sure, I would love to.
It's 3:40. We have not more than 10 minutes for this, and then we can give the microphones to people.
Okay, so we'll go to 3:45 your time then.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So Rose, you talked a bit about advice on doing focus groups. I wonder if you could expand a bit and talk about what are the skills that are associated with doing effective focus groups?
I think that many of the skills involved, but not all of them, are transferable. And I think people who chair meetings, for example, who run seminars, have a lot of those skills already in terms of including people, in terms of encouraging discussion. I think the main skill is really to do with multitasking, keeping several balls in the air, you know, listening to what's going on. You need to be questioning, listening, reflecting, teasing out the differences and similarities, and anticipating analysis. And it's quite a tall order, because I think you need to do all of this in a way that doesn't feel forced and that encourages people to relax and, you know, discuss things openly. I'm not sure if you can really train focus group moderators. I think you can certainly help people to capitalize on their skills and to, you know, to hone those.
Okay. So thinking about some of the challenges, you talked a bit about challenges with analysis of focus groups, and thinking along those lines of needing to be a multitasker when you're moderating. How do you handle things like groupthink when doing focus groups?
I think mainly through preparation and piloting. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it depends what the purpose of your focus group is. If it's to produce consensus guidelines, you know, then that's quite a good thing. If you really want to explore differences and shades of meaning, then you do want to steer people away from any emergent consensus. You want to prick that. You want to interrogate it. And I think you can do that in two ways. You know, you can think carefully about selecting your questions for your topic guide and your prompts, but you also need to, I think on your feet, pick up on any indications that people may see things slightly differently. And I think it's about not being too afraid of potential conflict, because I think we often don't give our focus group participants, you know, enough credit for being able to handle and sometimes to diffuse conflict and to give people permission to disagree. Because I think that that's often the data we want to get at. But sometimes in terms of groupthink, that the performativity that is involved actually is the data. And I'm thinking about the focus groups with the woman about weight loss after they've had the babies. And they sometimes really vied with each other to tell these funny stories. And they went into great long riffs about their enjoyment of food and such like. And I think, you know, that is the data. And, you know, I don't think it's useful to intervene and sort of nip that in the bud, because actually sometimes it's quite interesting that other people pick up on that, or they may question it or start to debate and argue.
So you talked a bit about being a multitasker. Now, what about using scripted questions and then allowing the conversation to evolve? Are there advantages, disadvantages? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it can come across as rather wooden if you rely overly on pre-scripted questions. I think there's a real skill in asking pre-scripted questions, but asking them in a fresh way. So that, you know, you might have run 15 focus groups, but, you know, you're still interested, you're still enthusiastic. I think, again, it's a question of balance, like so many things. Again, the structure as against the spontaneity and responsiveness. And I think a bit of both is quite a good thing. You know, this thinking on your feet again, picking up on any differences and picking up on things as they occur to you, and really inviting the participants, I guess, to problematize along with you and to give them permission sometimes to ask some questions of each other. because I think it's important to remember that participants can also get bored. So I think you need to give them some leeway so that they really can contribute in a meaningful way.
Okay, you've talked a lot about the benefits of using focus groups. From your experience, what have been some of the pitfalls or challenges for doing this type of data collection?
I think the most important one, I'd have to say, is inappropriate expectations that people sometimes have of focus groups, so that they're using them either as backdoor surveys, or they hope to get the sort of, narrative detail that you would get from one-to-one interviews. And of course, focus groups can't necessarily deliver that. I think the other main pitfall is the insufficient preparation and piloting, not just brainstorming, but really thinking about the questions you want to ask, making sure that they are going to generate the sort of data that you want, that your stimulus material is going to work, so that, for example, you might use a clip from a TV soap, and that to you might seem to go straight to the heart of what you want to discuss, but actually there may be a more compelling storyline that your participants want to talk about. So you do, I think, need to try those things out and to pay enough attention to sampling, that you can add to your, add your groups as you go along. But I think it does really pay dividends to think up front about the comparisons you're going to make. And I think a lot of the pitfalls that people fall into and a lot of the difficulties are really because they've not given sufficient thought as to, how to get the best out of focus groups, that they have some sort of preconceived idea about what focus groups will let them do, but at the same time, they're not really appreciating, I think, the full potential of focus groups.
Okay. Thanks, Rose. I think that's all the time we have for the interview, so I'll pass it over to Ricardo and see if there's some questions from other individuals.
Thank you, Amanda and Rose. Everyone, would anybody would like to ask a question, Dr. Barbour? Please feel free to do so. You can raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon, or you can write your question using the question pane. We don't have any questions yet, but I know that they always come up at the end. So please feel free to write your questions or raise your hands.
I can't see the question pane.
Yes, don't worry. I will.
That's okay. Okay.
I will read the questions for you as
Brilliant.
as they come up. But we don't have anything yet. Let me see.
Everyone's stunned.
Yeah, it looks like. Anyone? This is a great opportunity for you to ask questions. Anybody? Well, it looks like our audience is a little shy today. Let me see.
It's like trying to run a focus group through a webinar, isn't it? So that perhaps that's not the ideal forum for running a focus group.
Yeah. But would you like to add anything, perhaps? We have 5 to 6 minutes left.
I have one other question,
Okay.
if I can pose it.
Yes, go ahead.
You kind of touched on this, Rose, but is there opportunity for doing this type of analysis or data collection virtually? Has anything been done with online focus groups or?
Absolutely. Increasingly, people are turning to either pre-existing discussion groups or to actually moderating focus groups online, either through I think not so often through video conferencing, but just, through through posting questions. And of course, there's different challenges, whether that's asynchronous data generation or synchronous data generation. And there's quite a lot being written about this. I'm trying to think on the various references. There's a paper by Stewart and Williams in Qualitative Research, 2005. You can tell I'm sitting here with my book. It's volume 5, number 4, about researching online populations, and that's an excellent paper. I think that looks at the challenges, and I think it's often about developing, honing new skills, in order to deal with some of the new challenges that are thrown up. And I mean, I think there are also some strengths, so the way that people will use emoticons, for example, online, that we don't necessarily, we think we know what it means when we see someone pull a face, but that may not work cross-culturally, or we may misinterpret. So I think, emoticons can actually go quite a long way towards clarifying someone's, speaker's intent. So there are all sorts of advantages. I think, too, there's a possibility for using visual materials online, and particularly some, I think it was in one-to-one interviews, but there's no reason why you can't do it in focus groups as well, using vignettes and having unfolding vignettes, depend on the screen, depending on someone's first choice and then the successive scenarios following. So I do think there's a lot of potential. It's not something that I've done myself as yet. I have also I've done telephone focus groups, and I think that has some similarities. Some of the challenges are not dissimilar. I'm not being able to see people, but I think where you are trying to access people who are geographically quite scattered, it's an excellent way to do that, whether it's by telephone, whether it's online. And I think it does allow you sometimes to generate a lot of data in a really quite a short space of time, which can be particularly valuable. And obviously sort of social media as well, although those tend to be individual postings, but looking at at Twitter hashtags and the kind of discussions that go on there, I think is an emerging and really quite exciting area for research.
Rose, I have a few questions now, okay?
Okay. Oh,
yes,
good.
In fact, I have two things. One, a few people who have complimented you for your work. Samantha Hurst saying, Dr. Barbour has done an outstanding and very thorough job with the presentation. And then Bridget Smith from South Africa, thank you, Rose, lovely presentation, greetings from South Africa. Now, besides those two comments, I have a question from Claudia Alba. She does not have a microphone, so I'm going to write it. I'm going to read it. And then I have another two more questions. So Claudia Alba said the following: I have a lot of trouble when I want to analyze that big quantity of information. So I use Atlas.ti. But I want to know recommendations to order and analyze the information from Rose.
Okay, I'm really interested that you've singled out Atlas.ti, because I've been working on the second edition of this book, and I have to confess that I am not a real whiz with software analysis packages, largely because I am so elderly that when I learned to do qualitative data analysis, there weren't any software packages. So I tend personally to use them more for coding and for data retrieval, and I am not I've not got so much experience of looking at the theory building capacities of those packages. However, I've been very fortunate in that I've got three software trainers who have each sent me some examples of data coded up using the different packages, and have tried to illustrate, the properties of those packages. And one of them was in fact ATLAS.ti, and because the person who did this for me, who's Johannes Starkbaum from the University of Vienna, all his data was in German, so he's actually used some of my own examples from focus groups. And I can those certainly will be on. There's going to be an accompanying website with the book, but that's looking very much at, I suppose, looking at the patterning and the frequency of the code and how you can move from that towards, summaries, towards making, towards producing explanations, and towards theorizing. I mean, I don't think any of the packages, sadly, do the conceptual work or analytical work for you, but they certainly, do make it much easier to handle large amounts of data and to kind of see where the patterns lie, because I think it's very, very challenging to do that manually. I don't know if that answers the question at all.
Rose, I will give the microphone to Karen Debrot. She has a question, and I would like to see if we can hear her voice. Karen, okay. Your microphone is open. Okay, it may not be.
Okay, I didn't hear anything, I'm afraid.
No, neither did I. So I'm going to read her question. Okay. Have you heard of anyone doing focus groups through blogging sites?
Yes, I think not so much focus groups, I think, as looking at individuals' blogs. But I think that's probably going to be in its infancy, really, and there's no reason why, why that can't be used. I think there just are quite important ethical questions in that people know that what they write is in the public domain, but I think it's not quite the same thing as, accepting that that might be used for research purposes. And I think that there are all sorts of problems, and just this thing about sort of digital footprint and how, any of us can regret stuff that we have tweeted or blogged, but it's kind of out there forever, isn't it? But I think as well, it's going to be knowledge that's built up incrementally as people experiment really with these new ways of generating data or of harvesting data. And I think we need to be mindful of the limitations that we need to place around it as well, because I think sometimes we can all get a bit carried away and think that something's going to be the new panacea and the answer to all the problems. And actually, I think most methods, most approaches simply give rise to a different set of problems and challenges. But I think we have, a lot of fun trying to address them, and it really stimulates us, I think, to engage more critically with our methods and to be a bit more thoughtful.
Rose, we have only 2 more minutes, and I have another question from Ezequiel Flores. I will see if I can hear his voice. Ezequiel, your microphone is open.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
I don't speak very well English, but I want to know if you know about online focus groups or uses.
Just really that reference from there's been some work done on looking at blogs as well in terms of research that I thought was quite interesting on the Iranian diaspora in Canada and America, and looking very much at the sort of discourse analysis and the language used rather than so much the interaction. And I think that's where it gets a bit difficult, because there's not the same quick fire exchanges as I think you tend to have face-to-face. And I think it is much more fragmented, and the speech tends to be, you know, shorter, and I think that places some limitations on what you can, you know, what you can do with it. But certainly there's some work that I came across by people who use online focus groups with young people with potentially stigmatizing skin conditions, and that was interesting because I doubt that they would have got people, you know, to come along to face-to-face focus groups, and also they were quite a dispersed population. So I think there are lots of situations where online focus groups can maybe give us access to groups we couldn't otherwise access, to constellations of participants that we couldn't otherwise access. I'm not so sure that the data itself is likely to be that different. You know, it just gives rise to different challenges because it's shaped differently. And I think that quite often what people seem to have done is to combine online focus groups with, you know, some face-to-face interviews, or, you know, to send emails to, you know, to individuals as well. And I think it's, you know, it's important to bear in mind that it's not either or, and that we can be quite resourceful and imaginative in terms of mixing methods.
Thank you very much, Rose. It's 4:01 my time, Eastern time, and I think it's time to end. But before we say goodbye, I want to ask Amanda if you have anything to add. Amanda?
Just to draw people's attention to the IIQM website, there's information about our upcoming events, our Advances in Qualitative Methods Conference, which will be held in June in Edmonton, and Thinking Qualitatively workshop series, which is also held in June in Edmonton. There's lots of great workshops that we're offering here, and people can register for those.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I would also like to add that the 5th webinar of this series will be on May the 9th at the same time, and this is Dr. Sally Thorne, who will be presenting on the title of the presentation is What Does Method Matter in Applied Health Research? So that will be on May the 9th. And also, if you want training, a number of free webinars in Atlas.ti, just go to the Atlas.ti.com website, and there is a list there under training of a number of different free webinars and paid trainings too. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Rose, for your wonderful presentation. And I hope to see everyone back in our upcoming webinars. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rose.
You.
Thank you,
Okay.
Amanda.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye. Just one more thing, you know, before I forget. This is going to be available as a recorded video, as a video recording. Amanda, when will it be available on the website if I send it to you later today?
If you send me a link, then we can have it up by the end of the week.
Okay, perfect. So everybody go back to the IIQM website and look for the link for this recording. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.